Ancient India possessed one of the world's most complex and nuanced views of sexuality. Many of the things that shock us today were once commonplace in ancient India. For example, ritualized prostitution in sacred temples, or the third gender. And of course, you'll learn why Kama Sutra was actually invented. Sacred sexuality in tantric rituals. One of the most misunderstood traditions of ancient India is tantric sacred sexuality. In Tantra, sexual union was not viewed as an act of indulgence, but as a powerful spiritual tool. Certain tantric sects believed the controlled intimacy between consenting adults could awaken divine energy, known as Kundalini, leading to higher consciousness and liberation. These rituals were highly structured and symbolic. The physical aspect was secondary to meditation, breath control, and mental focus. Participants followed strict rules, and the goal was spiritual transcendence rather than physical satisfaction. While later interpretations sensationalized Tantra, historically it was practiced by a small, disciplined elite and was never casual or uncontrolled. To modern observers, the idea of sexuality as a path to enlightenment may seem shocking, but in ancient India, it reflected a worldview where body and spirit were inseparable. The sacred courtesans, the Devadasi system. Perhaps one of the most complex and, in its later years, controversial traditions was the Devadasi system. The term literally means servant of God. Under this tradition, young girls were married to a deity or a temple in a grand ceremony called Potukatu. Once married to the god, these women were considered Nitya Sumangali, eternally auspicious women who could never be widowed because their husband was an immortal deity. In ancient India, these women held a shockingly high social status, far above that of ordinary married women. They were the primary custodians of the arts, specifically Bharatanatyam dance and Carnatic music. The sexual tradition within this system was unique because the Devadasi was married to a god. Her physical intimacy with human men was seen through a different lens. She was not a prostitute in the modern sense, she was a sacred woman. High-ranking priests, kings, and noblemen would seek companionship with Devadasis. These relationships were often long-term and respected. The shocking element was that sexual union with a Devadasi was often viewed as a ritual act that bridged the gap between the human and the divine. The pleasure she provided was considered a reflection of the bliss, Ananda, of the gods. In other words, sex with Devadasi was considered one of the ways to connect with God. This is how some pray, while others simply have sex. In many ways, they were the only women in ancient India who owned property, were highly educated in Sanskrit, and had the freedom to choose their partners. However, as the centuries passed and colonialism took root, this tradition was heavily stigmatized by British Victorian morality, which could not grasp the nuance of a sacred dancer. What was once a prestigious spiritual and sexual role was eventually pushed into the shadows, leading to the exploitation of these women. In its prime, however, the Devadasi tradition was a shocking example of how a civilization could integrate female sexuality, high art, and temple worship into a single prestigious social class, proving that in ancient India, the sacred and the sensual lived under the same roof. The Kama Sutra as a social science. Often misrepresented as an erotic manual, the Kama Sutra was actually a sophisticated social text. Written by Vatsyayana, it explored relationships, marriage, emotional intimacy, and social harmony. Sexuality was treated as one of 4 essential goals of life, alongside duty, prosperity, and spiritual liberation. What shocks modern readers is not explicit content, but the openness with which intimacy was discussed, particularly mutual respect, female pleasure, and communication between partners. The text emphasized consent, compatibility, and emotional intelligence, concepts that were far ahead of their time. In ancient India, discussing sexuality intellectually was not scandalous. It was considered a mark of civilization. Temple eroticism and sacred art. Ancient Indian temples, such as those in Khajuraho and Konark, famously display erotic sculptures. These carvings shock many visitors today, but they were never meant to provoke arousal. Instead, they symbolized fertility, prosperity, and the totality of human existence. Sexual imagery was placed alongside depictions of daily life, gods, musicians, and warriors, suggesting that intimacy was a natural and respected part of life. In Hindu philosophy, denying sexuality was considered just as harmful as overindulgence. Temples represented the universe itself, and sexuality had its rightful place within it. Rather than secret or forbidden, these images were public and sacred, an idea that contrasts sharply with modern attitudes toward religious spaces. Why were such sexual images carved into temples? The reasons are as varied as the carvings themselves. Some historians believe this tradition was a test for the believer. Could you look at these worldly pleasures and still maintain focus on the divine within the sanctum? Others suggest they were educational tools for youth, or that they symbolized the celebration of the marriage of Shiva and Parvati. A more esoteric theory suggests that the depiction of sexual union on the outer walls was a way to ward off lightning and evil spirits, as Kama was considered a protective, life-affirming force. The third gender and the Hijra tradition. Ancient Indian texts like the Mahabharata and the Kama Sutra recognize the existence of a third nature, Tritiya Prakriti. This ancient tradition led to the formation of the Hijra community, individuals who were born male but adopted feminine traits or were intersex. While many cultures throughout history persecuted those who didn't fit the gender binary, ancient India had a shocking and unique place for them. They weren't just tolerated, they were believed to possess special ritual powers, particularly the power to bless or curse fertility. In many ancient sexual traditions, the Hijras were seen as the gatekeepers of the erotic world. They were often present at weddings and births, performing dances that were both ribald and sacred. The shocking part of this tradition is the religious foundation behind it. Many Hijras identify with Lord Shikandani from the Mahabharata or the goddess Bahuchara Mata. The tradition involved a nirvana ceremony, an elective ritual of emasculation, which was seen as a rebirth into a sacred non-binary state. By removing their manhood, they were believed to tap into a reservoir of spiritual power. During the Mughal era, this tradition evolved into the harem guard role, where they held immense political power. However, it was during the ancient period that their sexual and social identity was most clearly defined as a sacred anomaly. They were living proof that ancient Indian culture recognized that the human soul did not always match the human body. This tradition, which allowed for a recognized third gender with specific social and ritual duties, is a shocking precursor to modern conversations about gender identity, showing that ancient India was, in some ways, thousands of years ahead of its time in recognizing the complexity of human identity. The art of love marks as a language. To a modern observer, this might look like violence, but in ancient India, bites and nail scratches were a complex communication system between lovers. The Kama Sutra identifies 8 types of bites and 8 types of nail marks, each with its own name, like the peacock's foot or the tiger's leap. These marks were a badge of honor. A woman or man might intentionally leave them on visible areas, like the neck, to show others how passionate their partner was. It was a form of social status. The more skillful and deeper the marks, the higher the mastery of the lover. Rituals of the Ashvamedha, the sacrifice. Finally, we arrive at what is arguably the most shocking and controversial sexual ritual in the ancient Vedic texts, the Ashvamedha, or horse sacrifice. This was a grand political ritual performed by a king to prove his imperial sovereignty. A magnificent stallion would be set free to wander for a year, followed by the king's army. Any territory the horse entered had to submit or fight. If the horse returned undefeated, it was sacrificed in a massive ceremony. The shocking sexual element occurs during the climax of the ritual. According to the Yajur Veda, the chief queen, Mahishi, was required to undergo a symbolic, and sometimes described as literal in older texts, union with the sacrificed horse, while covered by a large cloth. The queen would lie down next to the animal, and specific verses were chanted to ensure the fertility of the kingdom and the virility of the king. The language used in these ancient verses is incredibly explicit and raw, shocking even by modern standards. This ritual was not about perversion, it was a profound, sympathetic magic ceremony. The horse was seen as a symbol of the sun and the cosmos, and the queen represented the earth. Their union was meant to ensure that the land remained fertile and the kingdom remained powerful. It represents a time when the boundaries between animal, human, and God were fluid. While the practice eventually became purely symbolic and was later discontinued as Indian society moved toward ahimsa, or nonviolence, the Ashvamedha stands as a jarring reminder of a primal, ancient world where sex, power, and death were woven into the very fabric of the state's survival. That's it. Now you know how people had fun in ancient India, and why the Kama Sutra is really needed.